Hey guys, welcome back to the Another Excuse podcast. I'm your host, Byron Greeley, and today's guest is Greg Cooke, the co-founder of Rafiki. Rafiki, in a nutshell, connects freelancers from Africa to global businesses. And they have an ecosystem of freelancers that cover graphic design, UX design, low-code dev, digital marketing. They do it all. And they're creating more than just a talent platform. They're creating a whole ecosystem of freelancers, founders, and agency owners, and collaborating to service top international startups and SMBs. We talk about how Rafiki works and how they've actually pivoted multiple times as they've progressed and learned from the market that they work in. We also talk about the future of work and how Greg sees more people becoming freelancers rather than working full-time roles, and how Africa is experiencing rapid growth and is a great place to source and look for freelance talent. We also chat a bit about his podcast, Diet Starts Monday, and what it's like running a podcast and what he's learned from the experience. It's, as you can hear, a wide-ranging conversation, and I really enjoyed this one. I'm sure you will too. Enjoy the show. Hey Greg, thanks for joining me today. Let's get right into it. So you're the founder of Rafiki. Could you tell us a bit about what Rafiki is and how it all works?
100%. Thanks so much for having me, Brian. So in a sentence, Rafiki helps digital and technical freelancers across Africa earn more through collaboration. There are multiple sides to this, and hopefully we'll get into some really interesting insights into the freelancer economy across Africa and globally, and more just generally how companies around the world are sort of starting to evolve quite quickly to leverage more freelancers. But we can probably talk about that in a bit more detail down the line. But yeah, we are a closed marketplace currently, focused on South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria, connecting those freelancers to one another. So an example being, and this is a real life example, we had a creative strategist approach us who had been approached by another client, but in order to close that client, they needed a graphic designer and a product designer to build out a brand visual identity and a website. So we connected the three of them, connected them to the client, and then basically helped the client manage that from a payroll and compliance standpoint. So yeah, that's where we're at the moment. I can go into a bit of the history in terms of how the company has evolved over the last 12 months. But to answer your question, I'll stop there. Cool. So I think, as is in the case with most startups, the idea in business has evolved super quickly and has been and continues to be iterated on. But we actually started as Recruitment, which I know is obviously quite close to you because your brother Connor works in recruitment. But the original idea was sort of conceived when I moved across to the UK and I was working for early stage startups. I've always worked in early stage startup. And the particular company I was working for outsourced a lot of product design, web development, and marketing functions to various freelancers and agencies. And I was in the position of managing those resources and realized how expensive they were in the UK. Got chatting to a few other companies and startups and heads of recruitments across the UK and realized that this was basically an increasing trend, more so than I had seen, or at least in my experience in South Africa. And they were outsourcing to these freelancers agencies to basically everywhere in the world bar South Africa, which obviously really frustrated me because I know how good the talent is back home. At the same time, around a similar time, I got chatting to my now co-founder, Nick, who had built a previous startup, and he had done so by basically leveraging freelance talent in South Africa. So a lot of synergies there. We started exploring the space and testing purely recruitment of fully remote developers out of South Africa into the UK. So we partnered up with some boot camps like We Think Code and Lewagon, basically to funnel their graduates into our pipeline, and then go around and try find companies that were looking for that talent. And there was a lot of initial demand from the talent side of our marketplace. The boot camps were interested, freelancers and developers were really keen to access international work. And initially, clients in the UK were willing to explore it, but there was a lot of uncertainty around the quality and generally sort of administration behind managing the talent. Due to that, we moved into basically a fully managed service, aka a freelancer agency. And then what we would do is we'd go out, do the matchmaking, but then actually do the sort of hand-holding of that talent more on a fixed term sort of project to project basis on behalf of those clients. And the more we did this and sort of continued exploring the freelancer economy and community in Africa, realized how much of an opportunity there was to, number one, I guess, help freelancers in Africa while providing value to international companies. And the deeper we got into this, the more we kind of stumbled upon and unraveled these sort of big macroeconomic shifts that we're seeing in the workforce and the future of work, which I'll touch on just now because it's probably a separate topic. But the sort of latest evolution of our product has been, while we've been running this freelancer agency, the two big pain points that we came across, the first was sort of scope creep. So inevitably a client will come to us and say they need a corporate identity built, a website designed, a website developed using a low-code platform like Webflow. Then they may need a sort of full stack engineer to come in and do a bit of custom development, and then maybe a marketing freelancer for their sort of go-to-market strategy. Inevitably, there's scope creep within that, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because it can just mean that there's more work. But what ended up happening is that resulted in huge payment issues from our side. Traditionally, how it's done is the client pays you 50% up front and 50% on completion of the work. And that's kind of the same as the way freelancers operate, which poses a lot of issues. Number one, for the freelancers on the team, because by the time let's say as an example, creative strategist has done their work, they then have to wait for the marketeer to take the product to market. So there's no sort of synergy between the flow of cash and the timing of payments across these pop-up teams of freelancers. And that was the pain points and the feedback we got from the freelancers we were chatting to who were doing the same as what we were doing, but independently of us. So we thought there was a really cool opportunity to explore basically the flow of money, how projects are scoped, and then how clients pay multiple freelancers and how potentially those freelancers pay themselves. And that's currently what we're sort of very focused on at the moment.
Awesome. Shit. There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
First thing I'd like to ask about is at the starting of Rafiki, you said you noticed an opportunity and you started discussing it and it kind of snowballed from there. But were you working in another job while Rafiki was sort of getting going, or did you just like dive headfirst into it?
Yeah, we started it on the side. And I actually started it in between jobs while on holiday in Portugal when it was more the recruitment side of things. So Nick and I spent $250, got a website up and running, and structured these partnerships with the boot camps. And then I actually started a new job. Nick had also recently started a new job, but from month one we were pretty profitable. So it was too good to say no, and it was one of those sort of late nights in the week and weekend activities that we just didn't want to shut down. The company I was working for, the new position that I joined, actually ended up folding about 8 months into it, and that resulted in the entire team being made redundant. And there was a huge delay in us actually getting our severance packages. We ended up only getting paid about 4 months later, which meant that I had to lean on Rafiki basically full time to get paid. And thank God I had that, because without it, I would have been in a really tricky situation in the UK. It was basically at that point that I decided, cool, I'm not going to look for a new job. I'm going to lean into this. Let's see where we can get it running. We got more interested in it. We uncovered these pain points. The company evolved super quickly. About 6 months later, we were in a position where Nick, my co-founder, could join as well on a full-time basis. And then shortly after that, we applied to something called the Baobab Network, which we can chat about just now as well, which is an accelerator program. And that really kind of was the inception of this new chapter of Rafiki, and actually starting to work towards building a venture backable startup, as opposed to it just being this side hustle for sort of supplementary income in addition to our full-time jobs.
Cool. And you said you were profitable quite early. How did you go about doing that? Was it like cold outreach to freelancers, getting them on board? What was sort of the process to ensure that you guys were profitable pretty quickly?
Yeah, initially we leveraged our network in terms of looking for clients who needed jobs to be done. On the freelancer side, it's been super easy, and it continues to be easy in terms of getting sort of organic applications onto our website. I think the most successful component of us recruiting freelancers has always come from referrals from freelancers that we've already used or utilized. And then slowly but surely the same from the client side. So after one or two successful client projects, that sort of slow trickle of word of mouth and referrals starts to kick in, which has been really good. For the first year, we didn't spend a cent on sales or marketing. I think I say profitable, but that's also because we weren't paying ourselves, high salaries or sort of probably market rates. We've been sort of scraping the barrel ourselves and doing everything we can to, basically just keep the lights on in those early stages, which can sometimes mean, putting yourself out there as a freelancer in any shape or form, and then just pushing that through the business and using that as kind of your entry point into maybe converting that customer into other revenue streams via other freelancers that you can embed into their teams down the line.
100%. So Rafiki links talent in Africa to global businesses, but as you mentioned, there are kind of like three parties involved at the like in the whole process. Is the talent, the businesses you work with, or the clients, and then your business. Can you walk us through how like each party in this process sort of benefits and like what the pros are of this compared to like hiring internally?
Yeah, 100%. I think for the freelancers, we're basically doing sales and sort of BDR on their behalf. So we're doing a lot on our side to drive demand into the platform that ultimately assists them. A lot of the time, these freelancers are really good at their jobs, but they aren't necessarily that great at sales or customer acquisition. And ultimately, you have to be really good at sort of customer-facing work to get repeat clients, which is where we come in and kind of facilitate that interaction. At least for now, we are slowly moving away from that aspect of the business because we don't see that as scalable. But that has been a focus, and it's been really interesting, and something a lot of the freelancers have said has been super helpful on their behalf. For clients, I think leveraging freelance talent used to be very much a sort of one-to-one gig-based style, almost like B2C relationships. So anyone who wants a quick website thrown up. And we continue to see that demand in fixed-term projects, but those projects are getting bigger and bigger to the point where they're actually becoming fractional, and the clients want ongoing relationships with either us and access to our sort of closed marketplace, or with a certain freelancer that they've worked with, in which case we're happy to embed that freelancer in their team, and if they need, help them with the payroll and the compliance of that. So generally, in terms of the advantages, leveraging contingent workforces, I would say it's a lot faster to hire. It's usually based on sort of outcomes and tasks as opposed to sort of traditional roles and positions, which means you can get a bit more granular on the specific skills required, which is where we've also offered a level of consultancy for various clients. A lot of the time, a client will come to us and say they need X, Y, and Z, and they've got a job brief. And it's a very traditional sort of recruitment job brief. And you can see they've probably just used this from historic briefs that they've used, or something they found on the internet. And we really help them objectively take a step back and break down, okay, what are the actual requirements of your business? Why do you think you need that? What are the future sort of roadmap releases of your product or your service, or calendar events coming up that you are building towards? And can we kind of reverse engineer that to actually find the right sort of software specific or skill specific freelancer for this task, as opposed to trying to go out and find a generic sort of marketing manager, where actually you need someone who's highly proficient in LinkedIn ads and has an understanding of the technicalities behind that. So that's been really interesting. And then from a business standpoint, I guess where we benefit is, we have got three revenue streams. The one is basically transaction costs on money coming through the business. And then the big one for us at the moment is basically subscription. So clients pay us anywhere between sort of £250 to £2,000 a month, and that's to access our service in varying degrees. And that's essentially a sort of pre-product release and something that they would be able to self-service themselves once our product is up and ready later this year or early next.
And I suppose also part of the business model is like labor is obviously cheaper in Africa. And so there's a bigger cushion or margin that you guys can operate with, which I suppose gives you freedom to sort of explore ideas and stuff. And it's not, the margins aren't as thin as if you were sourcing talent from a first world country.
Definitely. There is that salary sort of arbitrage play to it. We've been quite cognizant of the fact that we don't want to lean on that, because otherwise it becomes like, Upworks and Fivers, and it's really just a race to the bottom on rates, which isn't the business we're building towards. And actually a lot of the time, the top freelancers that we're embedding into client teams, because we're going quite senior, we're not that interested in junior talent. Their rates on an hourly or daily basis are pretty much on par with what you'd find in the US or the UK.
All right, that makes sense.
The value we're trying to add is over and above the actual arbitrage of salary there.
Cool. And just out of interest, like what sort of notable problems or hurdles have you guys run into through the journey so far?
It's a good question. I think early on we made a few mistakes with not vetting the talent properly. Neither Nick or myself have worked in an agency, nor have we been freelancers ourselves. So and there's a specific example for our first client that needed a product designer. And they asked for a product designer in a specific low-code software. We went out and sourced that designer. Designer happened to be someone we sort of knew through a friend of a friend. So we made the mistake of immediately sort of trusting what they said, as opposed to doing our own internal sort of DD on them. And ultimately the designer didn't end up performing. This was a case where the clients had no interaction with the designer, and they were going through via myself and Nick, which it was also kind of an aha moment for us, because we realized quite quickly that this designer just wasn't proficient enough, but we were able to sub another designer in who ended up doing a really stellar job. And that client actually ended up being one of our longest and biggest clients to date. And that's where we realized, the freelancer agency model was quite interesting, and something that, we have used to date to fund our exploration of the space. But ultimately isn't the bigger picture here. We want talent and clients to have, direct contact, and for us as a business to really sort of facilitate that exposure for talent in Africa, considering it's traditionally been a very overlooked demographic globally.
Yeah. And from that experience, what's your guys' approach now with sourcing talent and ensuring that it is of high quality?
Yeah, we've got a few basically sort of funnels. The one is organic, so every day we've got a trickle of applications coming into the site. Occasionally a client will come to us and ask for very specific requirements, in which case we'll go out and source either on existing platforms, which hasn't been that successful. The biggest success for us has been in leveraging our own network, so asking freelancers that have worked with us to source it for us, and then we've got a sort of kickback referral mechanism there. Then that ultimately always ends up with the highest quality. And then going on to sort of really niche forums, so whether it's on Quoras or subreddits or Slack communities or LinkedIn groups that are kind of hyper focused around what the client needs or what we need for the client. So an example could be a Slack community of low-code developers and a channel within that of Webflow guys or girls in Nigeria. And then we'll go into that. We'll understand that there's obviously a sort of super high intent, like niche community skill set there. That's the sort of acquisition strategy. And then in terms of the vetting, what we've done is invited various freelancers into our basically vetting process. So we've had engineers, Figma designers, and various Webflow, Relium, Framer developers, low-code developers, actually write tests for us, which we've paid them to do. And when it gets to sort of interview stage, sometimes those freelancers sit in on myself or Nick interviewing the candidate, just to make sure that these freelancers actually do know what they're talking about. We then usually try to test them internally on a project, whether that's our Rafiki website or, a really small fixed term client project, before feeling confident enough to put them on, a much larger fractional client.
And is it you guys doing most of that at the moment, or like how big is your team?
Yeah, it has been to date. Now we've taken a step away from that because we've got a solid application database. We've actually got a huge backlog that we still need to get through. And those organic applications have kind of surpassed the need for us to go out and source directly, unless it's something really specific. In terms of the full-time team, it's myself, Nick, our CTO, Steve, we've got a head of sales and partnerships, Noi, and then we've got about 15 freelancers in various fractional capacities that sort of make up our core sort of agency team. And then we've got just over 300 freelancers that we've vetted that are sort of ready to go on various client projects.
That's really, really cool. And how did you guys go about building out the immediate team? Is it people in your network, or were you just, say you're looking for a CTO, or like how did you approach that?
Yeah, well, I get the big two hires there were Steve, our CTO, and Noi, the head of sales and partnership. Steve was Nick's CTO at his previous company.
Okay.
He built and ran his own development agency, for about 6 years. And he's got very specific experience building out payments and invoicing software, which is highly applicable to the new direction of our software, because we're building out basically split invoicing and sort of software to specifically address the cash flow issues that freelancers face. And then Noi, our head of sales and partnerships, he actually reached out to us at the time. He was working at a venture capital company in Tunisia. He's from Ghana, but grew up and went to school and studied in the UK. And the VC company that he was at was slightly too late stage for us, but he reached out regardless. He was really interested in what we were doing. He happened to be coming across to London a few weeks later, so we said, "Cool, if you're in the area, come meet us at the WeWork in Waterloo," which he did. And it just kind of started to happen organically from there. A few conversations later, we started the interview process. We thought he was super impressive. We thought his experience was interesting. He really resonated with our mission in terms of helping freelancers in Africa earn more. So yeah, that was Noi and Steve. It's a very small team. We'll probably keep it quite small as long as possible. We sort of practice what we preach and what we believe fundamentally, that the efficient size of full-time teams has become a lot smaller because of AI efficiency and what you can do with leveraging various automations and integrations and plugins and the likes, and then scaling up and down the team kind of as and when big client demand or internal project demands fluctuate.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, and make sense that you can sort of lean on basically the service that you're offering to scale your team without having to permanently hire people, which is really cool.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think and this is sort of diving a bit into the bigger trends that we're seeing in any business, and ours included. Human resources are the number one cost center for startups, scale-ups, enterprise companies, whatever it is. And the key to innovation and growth, we believe, lies in maintaining a super strong balance sheets and operating as lean as you can, and being able to make these quick moves and shifts as the sort of market changes. So the moment you can move from fixed costs to variable costs is the moment you can start to reduce risks, and you can start to scale those costs and resources quickly and effectively. And the obvious place for that to start is in your headcount, right? Yeah. So what we're seeing is that teams are decreasing in size. The use of contingent workforces is increasing. And then just from a hiring standpoint, in today's world, and we've seen it over the last 2 years with GPT and this sudden massive boom and all this AI efficiency, is spending 3 to 8 months hiring, which is the average based on various degrees of seniority. That's just to place that candidate, and then let alone get that candidate sort of onboarded properly and understanding your business or building a team below them. By that point, you've fallen behind. Your entire market's changed. There's new releases that your competitors have caught on to. And where you can kind of get ahead with that is by leveraging, freelancers or fractional teams, and where this whole concept of fractionalization of work really comes into play. I think traditionally fractionalization was you'd come across things like a fractional CFO or fractional CMO, one candidate who's quite senior, probably C-suite level, working across multiple different companies. I think what we find super interesting and more relevant and what we're more bullish about for the future is actually the fractionalization of traditional jobs at the C-suite level and probably more applicable further down. So this big move from sort of titles and jobs into roles and tasks, and those specific roles being torn apart into industries, software, specific skills to cater for a much more efficient hiring, sort of time and cost allocation, while at the same time really allowing for a more sort of granulated specialization of workforce skills. So an example could be, let's say myself, who previously worked as a growth manager. If I was hiring a growth manager now, I would think long and hard about what the actual requirements were for my business, and instead of hiring a growth manager that's going to cost a lot and it's a indefinite contract and it's a huge hit on my business if I'm a startup, see if you can kind of deconstruct that position via one or two or three freelancers. So how that might sort of transpire is, let's say a growth manager for your business is going to be spread across digital marketing. Let's say that's specific to, I don't know, meta ads. And at the same time, they might be spread across sort of managing a small team of designers and developers, vice versa. And rather than, expecting to find this unicorn position that kind of caters to all of that, you can cut costs and bring in the right skill sets as and when, your company needs. And where I think that's really exciting and relevant for the African workforce is that it basically changes the way sort of the education standpoint and how that affects job opportunities, especially for overlooked demographics like the freelancer economy in Africa. As I've said, sort of the tech has changed and is rapidly changing, and with it, the labor market and, in our belief, the fractionalization of work. But what hasn't changed or isn't changing fast enough, at least in my opinion, is the sort of slow moving gears of our educational systems. So traditional colleges and universities, which are often really financially exclusive or overly lengthy and really just an inefficient use of time, aren't going to be as necessary. And what the sort of alternative there is, I guess, is basically these online boot camps and sort of DIY upskilling and this shift to lifelong learning. So education won't be this lump sum that you kind of consume in the first 20 years of your life, but it's something that you sporadically consume throughout your career because the pace of change, the pace of technological change kind of necessitates it. And as more and more people move towards becoming independent contractors or freelancers or fractional specialists, which is happening, the stats around this are crazy. Out of competitive necessity, you're going to have to keep upskilling. But for the most part, the entry point into upskilling is basically free or at a fraction of the cost of these universities, which I think is hugely exciting for freelancers across Africa.
That is really interesting, and like I can see it happening, but at the same time, I feel like one side, probably the hiring side, is going to move slightly faster than the talent side in terms of we're used to, or we see a traditional job as like a safety net. And, it's like we've signed a contract, we're guaranteed that amount of income. And this is me just making assumptions here, but like I feel like some people might struggle to shift over to the freelancer mindset and that sort of like you're in full control over how much you earn, and they could see it as a bit more risky. So I'm putting you on the spot here, but do you have those stats available? I'm curious about the shifting over to freelancer stats that you mentioned.
Yeah, I don't have them in front of me, but I do remember a few. I mean, the most recent one, and most of the research is coming out of the States, but there's been a 130% increase in independent workers over the last 3 years. I'd love to actually find these stats for you and share them across, or maybe we can do a reshoot of this specific clip, because it's super important. And the stats are basically on both sides as well in terms of the shift between companies leveraging contingent workforces, meeting this rapid demand. I think, without having the stats on hand, my sort of intuitive guess is that the reality is that the best young candidates entering the workforce probably don't want to work for you. They want to work for themselves. They want that autonomy, diversity, and flexibility. And companies need to figure out, better ways to engage with them. Kind of going back to our belief, we believe that the majority of young people entering the workforce won't ever work for a single company for more than a few months. And instead, nearly everyone will be freelance or fractional. But what will happen at the same time, out of necessity, is that these freelancers or consultants, and basically just young people working independently, will want to belong to some form of community, and that these networks or communities or platforms will need to offer additional value drivers for independent talent, things like insurance, medical aid, various other benefits, all the things that full-time employees have traditionally received. And what really needs to happen now, and that's essentially what we're building at Rafiki via this sort of SaaS-enabled marketplace, is for this freelance talent to have some sort of digital home and sort of sense of belonging and true intentionality behind the word community, that can also provide benefits and some sort of security in place. A stat that has just come to mind now, which isn't necessarily relevant to the rise of the actual volumes of contingent workers, but more based on the upskilling and sort of staying ahead of the curve, in that 15% of freelancers spend 15% of their time upskilling compared to 3% of traditional employees. So that kind of alludes to that fact that, this continuous learning ensures that this demographic remains at the forefront of their fields, which is highly attractive to customers or clients wanting to sort of stay relevant in the changing market.
Yeah. And maybe my assumptions in it changing slowly maybe is wrong, because if people are hiring, and even if it's younger talent, people in traditional jobs or losing their jobs are going to have to adapt just to make money and to survive. So the adaptation could happen a lot faster than I initially thought.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a big contributor to it, in that, because full-time teams are becoming smaller and that efficient size of full-time teams has decreased so much, there's been, and we've seen it over the last few years, massive layoffs, right? So there's a huge percentage of the workforce that has, out of necessity, had to start freelancing. I think that's the older demographic that had full-time jobs, were comfortable in it, and have now realized, you're actually never safe in your full-time job. It's probably a good bet to always have some sort of supplementary income stream, like I had with Rafiki, that I could lean on. And then the younger workforce entering is actually saying, well, I don't actually want a full-time job, and I'd rather, work for myself, but still need some sort of affiliation to a community and benefits, etc. And that attitude towards freelancing as the sort of gig economy and a way to supplement your income is what we're seeing is quickly changing into actually, a full-time career, and people viewing freelance as a completely viable career path. What's been interesting and super sort of eye-opening for us in paying these freelancers back in South Africa is, for the most part, all of them are earning way more than I was ever earning in a full-time position back in Cape Town,
Awesome.
which is nuts. Some of these guys are earning over 100K, and they're sort of a few years out of college, and that's month on month, which is phenomenal. So I think that sort of word of mouth starts to spread through the younger communities, hence this adoption, and freelancers getting quite specific on the skills they learn and heading towards freelancing as a career choice.
Yeah, that's amazing. And sorry, I didn't ask about sort of your pricing structure, but I think you touched on it a bit. Is it like a subscription-based model, or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So the one is purely just transactional through the platform. If we are handling the actual payments and the compliance and the split invoicing, which we're currently doing manually, that's what we're building out to automate. The other one is subscription from either freelancer or client side of things, into our service offering, which will ultimately be productized. So those are the two main fees. Occasionally, we've had an instance where a client has wanted the freelancer in-house on a full-time basis, in which case it becomes a kind of recruitment play, which follows traditional recruitment, sort of 20% of annual salary style the earnings.
Cool. And you mentioned that you guys went through the Baobab Accelerator. Could you briefly explain what an accelerator is and how it works?
Yeah, sure. So the Baobab network is one of Africa's leading very early stage investors and accelerators. They've got a team spread across South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and the UK. And I stand under correction here, but each year they invest in 2 cohorts of 10 startups across the continent. So successful startups who apply and get into the accelerator get access to 3 months of hands-on virtual support. So the Baobab Accelerator is all online. And that includes, anything from startups that need support with brand or marketing or positioning. The really helpful component for us specifically was the financial modeling and sort of investor readiness side of things. And those 3 months basically culminate in a online pitch to other investors at the end of the 3 months. So yeah, that's the Baobab network. We found it really helpful. The reason why we decided to go with them is because we're obviously focused on Africa and an African tech startup, but we are based in the UK, and we thought the Baobab network, who have offices in the UK, would kind of be the optimal decision for us in that sort of UK Africa corridor.
Cool. And do they make an investment at the beginning in exchange for some equity, or how does that work?
Yeah, they do. So in total, they invest $100,000 USD in exchange for 12% of the company.
Awesome. And you'd say that was worth it, that sort of agreement?
Yeah, I think it depends entirely on the stage of your startup and the sort of end goal of your startup. For us, when we applied, we were realistically sort of 4 to 5 months into building Rafiki. What we pitched Rafiki to get into the Baobab network was different to what we ended up pitching to other investors at the end of the accelerator, and which is also somewhat different to what Rafiki is now, which is natural, right? Any early stage startup is going to continue evolving quite quickly. I think in terms of the investment amount, if you're based in Africa, that $100,000 would obviously go a lot further than if you're based in the UK. But again, depending on the nature of your product, that might be enough to get you to a point where you don't have to raise again. So I'd say it's totally dependent on who you are as a founder, what your aspirations are for sort of international expansion, and the stage of your startup journey.
Nice. And you mentioned that you guys pitched again at the end of the accelerator. So you felt Rafiki needed a bit more investment to achieve what you guys wanted to achieve?
So you have to pitch. That's part of the accelerator, regardless of whether you're actually looking for funding or not. It's just part of their basically the education they give you in terms of being able to pitch and that sort of investor readiness. But at the end of the day, it's your decision whether or not you want to continue fundraising or not.
And did you guys want to continue fundraising?
Yeah, we have. We've kind of just kicked that off properly again. And yeah, it's been really interesting. It's been my first time, going through that process. Have and continue to learn quite a bit. We're lucky in that we've positioned the company in a way that we can sort of practice what we preach in terms of scaling up and down those resources. So our overheads aren't particularly high. And right up until the Baobab Accelerator, we were cash flow positive, if not profitable. When we took on the investment, we increased our burn when we started to hire, like when we hired our head of sales and our CTO. And now we're getting back to the point where we're sort of cash flow positive. So we're still sort of going back and forth between how much is the right amount to raise for us, and how we approach that raise, sort of what vehicles we go through, whether it's early stage VC or strategic angels. But at the moment, we are going for it, and we've got a sort of clear direction as to what we're raising and how we'll deploy that capital.
And what advice would you give someone considering or looking to fundraise?
Sure. Get get ready for a lot of no's and a lot of frustration. I think you're going to get a lot of no's from people or companies that probably know a lot less about your market or business model or vision than you do as a founder, which can be really frustrating. But I think it's quite important to not take that personally. At the end of the day, it's your job as a founder to educate the investors you're talking to if you suspect that they don't know enough about the market to make an informed decision. But I would say it's been, in some cases, quite frustrating. So an example being, the feedback we recently got was that the investor doesn't invest in, open marketplaces, so talent marketplaces, and that there's no need for a localized version in Africa. And I think two things: by saying that or using that as an excuse to turn down the opportunity, they've immediately neglected the fact that we as founders have the unique insight into the market and the problem and the opportunities, and are actually, they're just making a decision based off their high level understanding without giving us the chance to actually educate, which you would think from an early stage VC is essentially what they're all about. And that's probably just because they're completely inundated in applications. So it's those kind of examples that you kind of have to not take too personally. I would say that ties into the fact that there's a big delay in, going out and finding a VC that, your company fits their investment mandate and filling out the application online, and then get ready for, anywhere between like a 3 week to a 3 month delay until you get an automated reply. And there's varying degrees of sort of service from various VCs. So that can also be quite frustrating. I'd say advice is, if you do have network, leverage it hard. Scour LinkedIn if you can find an associate or analyst or someone in a VC firm there's a mutual connection there. Do what you can to try get a warm intro, because those really help. The angel and venture capital conversations that we're furthest down the funnel with have always been the ones that have come from a warm introduction. And then I guess lastly, I'd say just back yourself, because, at the end of the day, if you've done your research, you definitely do know more than the investors that you're pitching to. So if you get a no, shake it off, continue. It probably is a numbers game. And try to get your business in a position where you potentially don't need funding, or you don't need that much. So yeah, that's kind of advice that I'd give it.
Yeah, that is great advice. Yeah, I've heard it's a lot of no's, and you need thick skin to get through.
It's really brutal. Yeah.
And so you mentioned that you guys you have like a freelance management platform, and is it called Rafiki X? Is that right?
That's what we're building. Yeah, at the moment. So we had sort of 3 tiers of the platform. It was Rafiki Works, which was the agency play. 2, Rafiki Works, the agency play, and then Rafiki X, which is now this SaaS that we're building. That's very focused on talent collaboration, how that collaboration basically ties into split invoicing and split billing for clients. And then from the client side of things, it's more focused around sort of payroll and compliance and the project management of those pop-up teams of multiple freelancers. We find, a talent marketplace isn't unique. There's a new matchmaking marketplace popping up every week. We find the biggest pain points, the biggest opportunities actually really happen after that matchmaking has been done, once work kicks off, which is what Rafiki X is very focused on. We've obviously decided to focus on Africa for, one of a few reasons. Number one being, South African founders. We wanted to stay close to home while being in the UK. Number two, as we researched that marketplace, we realized that the pain points and the opportunities for African freelancers was quite unique. And then number three, in that just Africa as in general is actually the fastest growing freelance economy in the world, which positions it as a really nice sort of sandbox for us to really test and validate our product and service assumptions before potentially looking to offer it as a service to freelancers globally, or any enterprise clients around the world who are looking to use our software to manage their own contingent workforces, regardless of our marketplace, which is kind of the cherry on top to the software that we're building.
Yeah. So I suppose building out the SaaS also differentiates you from all the other competitors and gives you the opportunity to spot opportunities and like spin up solutions to those problems. So it basically, the beast continues to grow and makes your company more and more unique in the space.
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, I mentioned earlier, this need for, in the future, a sense of belonging and these sort of digital homes or communities for freelancers, which, opens up the door for other financial products or insurance products or healthcare or wellness or benefits products, which isn't a focus for us down the line, but it's definitely in the sort of future, like 3 to 5 year plan. Whether that's something we build out ourselves or probably more realistically, we look to partner with other providers on. It's definitely a strategy we see as something worth pursuing as we sort of slowly sort of go down the funnel of utility that we can provide the freelancer economy in Africa.
Yeah. And well, you touched on it a bit there, but what is the 5-year plan for Rafiki? What do you guys see the company looking like in 5 years?
I think within the next 3 years, we'd want to be the brand for freelance talent in Africa. At the moment, we're quite focused on product designers and low-code developers. Ultimately, we'd want to get to the point where we've doubled down on the collaboration side of things, which would mean sort of going a little bit more horizontal in terms of the product skill sets and suite that we offer. In 5 years' time, I think we'd want to be a force to reckon with globally, and we'd want to be, one of the top softwares that enterprise clients are using around the world to manage their contingent workforces. Hopefully, that means it's inclusive of a lot of African freelancers. That is our sort of where the business is anchored and what our initial vision was. So yeah, that's kind of the big plan.
And before we end, I have to ask about your podcast, Diet Starts Monday. I was a guest on the podcast a few months ago and I really enjoyed it. And I was just curious, like, how have you found hosting a podcast?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. So it's not something that comes naturally to me. I decided to join Roscoe and the guys who started Diet Starts Monday more as a challenge to myself because I've always shied away from public speaking. And I thought it'd be a good opportunity to, number one, grow my personal network in the UK. Being a South African in the UK without a big sort of professional network, it's kind of an obvious tactic to do that. And then number two, to put myself out there and sort of challenge myself around, public speaking and that. So it's been really interesting. I think it's probably in a similar manner to sort of being a founder and trying to look for investment. It's like you keep chipping away and you get sort of better and better at it as you go. But it's been really interesting. We've got big plans for the rest of this year and for next year, as I'm sure you do too. So yeah, man, it's been really cool.
And what kind of podcast is it? What could someone expect if they went to listen to it?
So at the moment, it's pretty agnostic in terms of the guests we have on board. Anything from sort of athletes training for big ultra marathons to young sort of indie entrepreneurs trying to break through. So it's very casual. It doesn't have a specific topic. So if there's anyone listening who's keen to get on it, come on board. We recently had a friend of ours who specializes in ADHD and autism. And she basically teaches parents around sort of coping mechanisms for kids that navigate that throughout their life. And via the podcast, she actually managed to get one of her first clients. So it's those kind of like little wins that I guess make the podcast worth it.
That's awesome. Is that Kate?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna have her on my podcast too.
Yeah,
I find awesome. The topic really interesting.
It's super interesting and she's incredibly knowledgeable about it.
Cool. And what would you say is the best part about podcasting for you?
I think the guests, as cliche as that may sound, it's getting access to someone else's mind and expertise and passion in quite a sort of condensed space of time, which is really cool. And inevitably, the guests that we chat to almost always introduce us to someone else. So that kind of flywheel effect of snowballing your network really does start to kick in, which has been one of the most rewarding things for me.
Yeah, I've been surprised at how willing a lot of people are to come on a podcast and have a conversation. And I really think it's a hack. You don't need the biggest podcast in the world, and you can have conversations with some really interesting people. So I'd recommend it to anyone. But do you guys, most of your podcasts are in person, is that correct?
Yeah, that is. We actually haven't ever done one remotely.
No, is that a bit of a logistical nightmare, or does that make it a bit more difficult to get guests on?
I think it definitely is limiting to some regard. I mean, case in point with, you're sitting in London, I'm currently in Hermanus. It's I think your network expands if you are willing to do it remotely. I joined the podcast late, so they were doing it in person in Cape Town. Roscoe, who was moving across to London, wanted to do it in person in London. So we just make do with what we can. It definitely does make it harder in finding guests, but when you are sitting in a room with those guests, I don't know, it feels slightly more sort of personal and engaging. We've got exciting plans in terms of getting our own studio this year, actually, which will be really cool. So hopefully, when you visit back from your stints in Dubai, we can have you in the studio.
Yeah, 100%. I found that the in-person conversations do have a little bit more. It's like, there's something that you can't really put your finger on, but I do feel like it adds something to the conversation. So I want to have some in-person conversations in my podcast. I just don't have the gear for it at the moment, so that's also another investment.
100%, yeah. And you can mix it up. You could do both, right? Sort of as and when you're able to find guests in person or online.
Yeah. And this is a tough question, but if you could or had to pick someone, who would be your dream guest to have on a podcast?
Sure, that's a tough one, because do you go sort of like role model athletes or like someone like Elon Musk or something like that? I think I listened to a really interesting podcast the other day by Rory Sutherland. I don't know if you know who that is.
Yeah, I love what he puts up.
He's so interesting. He's one of the most interesting thought leaders in I guess all fields of marketing and sort of behavioral economics. Super innovative thinker, and the way he communicates is just exceptional. And I've read one of his books, Alchemy, twice actually, which explores that kind of unconventional and often irrational aspects of human behavior within the context of marketing and business. He basically argues that like irrational thinking can often lead to super innovative solutions and creative breakthroughs that traditional logic might overlook, which I find really interesting because I'm generally someone who acts out of guts or intuition. So his thought process is definitely the content of his book is definitely a rationale I gravitate towards. And probably one I would imagine most founders would gravitate towards as well, because it's ultimately saying, like, back yourself and your intuition over needing the necessary stats and data to make informed decisions. Because when you are a founder and you're in a super early stage journey, for the most part, you just don't have the data and the sort of references to make informed decisions. So you do just have to trust your gut, which is a really hard thing to get your head around, but is probably what makes the best founders the best founders. So yeah, I would have Rory Sutherland on, just because I think you could ask him one question and he'd speak for like 10 hours and you'd just be like on the edge of your seat, like mind blown.
Yeah, he'd be a great guest. I actually met a guy at a My First Million podcast meetup, and he's working with Rory Sutherland and trying to get Rory on the My First Million podcast. And so I helped him with like a tweet thread, trying to get the host's attention and stuff like that. So hopefully he goes on the podcast, because I think that'll be quite a unique one.
Jeez, yeah, that'd be epic. Then you've got to get him on yours as well after that.
Yeah, one day. Before I end every podcast, I ask my guests if they have a question for me.
Yeah, I think kind of going back to what we chatted on very briefly before we started recording, and you're big in the content game across, various verticals of content creation, the pod being one of them. How, over the last year or two, have you seen that industry change, I guess, with reference to, Gen AI, and various forms of sort of automated content creation, for better or for worse? What are the sort of trends you've seen, and how has that impacted your role as a content creator in written content or video?
That's a great question. I've noticed that it's happening. It's going to happen more and more, but people are going to resonate with genuine, authentic content even more so than they do now, because there's going to come a point where it's going to be difficult to distinguish between human created content and AI created content. And when we reach that point, there's going to have to be something that signals that it's human created content. And I think people are going to be really hungry for it, because there's just going to be so much shit out there that and then we could even take a step back, that like overproduced, good looking stuff might not be worth making. And like we're seeing people like Sam Sulek, I don't know if you're familiar with him, where he literally hits record and works out, and he's got millions of subscribers on YouTube. And I think people are gravitating towards the authentic, understated, like, this is me, I'm not trying to be anyone else. And I think that's going to happen more and more, because it's going to be so difficult to figure out whether someone is authentic or not.
100%. And you can see that in brands sort of adopting in their marketing strategies. It's often less curated now, and quite sort of scrappy and almost sort of amateurish. Even in something as simple as, using like old school film filters or something, there's a sort of throwback to this bygone age of sort of rustic content that's become in vogue again, which is quite interesting. It probably is quite circular. They just sort of keep going through these different trends, but that's super interesting. And then last one, I mean, just right back at you, who's your sort of go-to dream guest to have on the pod?
Mine would probably be one of the podcast hosts that I listen to so frequently. So there's a few up there. It'll be very difficult to pick one. If I had to pick one, it'll probably be Chris Williamson at the moment.
Okay. Yeah.
Or possibly the guys of the My First Million podcast, Sean Puri and Sam Parr. And then Tim Ferriss is also up there. I'd say those guys, because it'll be a combination of like the podcast type of questions, but they also are launching businesses and things like that. So I feel like there's endless amounts of questions I could ask them that would just like satisfy my own needs and urges. Because that's also what I found, like the best episodes, or that I've felt were the best episodes, are the ones where like I'm literally scratching my own itch and I'm asking questions that I'm curious about, that I want to know. I think it just comes across more genuine and leads to a more interesting conversation than trying to ask questions that I think other people might want to know the answer to.
100%. I mean, it goes back to that authenticity of the content that you just mentioned.
And speaking of, this isn't really in line with authenticity, but two business profiles that are very interesting to check out are ClickUp and Nutter Butter.
Nutter Butter, I haven't heard of it.
Yeah. Nutter Butter, it's like a peanutty chocolate brand in America, and their profile is insane. It is the weirdest content I have ever seen, and it's growing really, really fast, which is also another commentary on like what resonates with people, and not putting much thought into the content we create and still getting traction. But yeah, you should check it out. The Nutter Butter one is mind-blowing, and then the ClickUp content is like two guys just running their content that is really, really intelligent and smart and coming up with cool content ideas for businesses.
Interesting. I'll definitely check it out. Yeah, I'm keen to check out Nutter Butter. Is it the kind of content that sort of makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, or is it?
Yeah, and it's like it looks like it was, all the text is like, looks like it was made on like word art, and someone's really pixelated, and the animations are really like blocky and not smooth, and and it's like scary faces, and it's just really weird to look at. You just scroll through it and you're like, this has nothing to do with the brand, and yet last time I checked, they had 500,000 followers, but I think it's growing pretty quickly. I think they'll reach 1 million quite fast.
Shit. I'll definitely go check them out after this.
Sweet. Well, thanks for joining me today, Greg. If people want to find out more about yourself, Rafiki, or Diet Starts Monday, where can they do so?
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Byron. It's been really, really interesting. I think people can just reach out on LinkedIn. I'll always reply to messages. Rafiki works. Rafiki.works is our website. If you're a freelancer interested in getting on board, or if you're a client looking for needs, hit us up. And then, Diet Starts Monday. Follow us on Instagram. That's the big channel there. We've also got, one or two sort of running and cycling clubs via the podcast in London. So if anyone's into that, it'd be great to get you on board.
Cool. Thanks, Greg. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate you making it all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the episode. One more quick reminder before you go. I have a weekly newsletter by the same name, Another Excuse, where I cover 4 topics: something that has changed my perception, a tool that could be useful to you, content that is actually worth consuming, and a concept that I try break down and explain. If this sounds of any interest to you and you need a kick up the arse, then you can subscribe at the link below. Thanks for joining me again, and I'll see you next week.